In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world.
Europe has been observing the escalating trade tensions across the Atlantic with growing concern. The protectionist measures initiated by the United States, known as the Trump tariffs, first targeted China, then Canada and Mexico, and have now reached the European Union. On April 2nd, the White House announced new tariffs on cars and car parts imported from Europe, averaging around 20%. This decision angered Europe, which was already dealing with previous tariffs on steel and aluminum. At the end of March, the European Commission issued a strong statement on April 3rd declaring, "We will stand up to the trade injustices caused by American policies." Commission President Ursula von der Leyen even addressed the issue at a recent summit in Central Asia, stating, "If bilateral trade liberalization gives way to unilateral impositions, we will not refrain from reciprocal measures." Some view this as a turning point for Europe. But which products might the EU target in retaliation against the United States? Which countries are leading this plan, and which brands in particular will face new import duties? European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has expressed strong opposition to these developments. Previously, the President of the European Commission criticized the United States for adding 25% tariffs on goods from the EU. She said Europe was ready to react. The day before, the U.S. included the EU among several countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea that would face higher tariffs. This marked America's biggest shift towards protectionism since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The Commission president warned that the tariffs would seriously affect people and businesses that had benefited from trade with the U.S. since World War II. As the biggest single market in the world, the EU believes it must defend itself against the serious harm to global trade caused by the U.S. pulling away from cooperation. She added, "There is no order, only confusion. There's no clear path through the chaos being created, and every U.S. trade partner is affected." At a summit in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, she also said, "We're finishing up our first set of countermeasures in response to steel tariffs, and we're ready to take further steps to defend our interests if talks don't succeed." She warned that as cheaper goods from China and others are shut out of the U.S. market, they'll likely be sold in Europe instead. "We will keep a close eye on these effects. We cannot handle global overproduction, and we will not accept dumping in our markets." She also spoke about how these tariffs would hurt everyday people. Food prices, medicine, and transport will all cost more. Inflation will go up. Doing business with the U.S. will become much harder. On Wednesday, ING Bank lowered its economic growth forecast for the Eurozone next year from 1.5% to 0.9% because of the tariffs. Still, the EU didn't launch immediate retaliation. The Commission handles trade talks on behalf of EU countries. Their main trade negotiator, Maros Sefcovic, is scheduled to meet with EU ambassadors this Friday to discuss next steps. Over the past 10 years, trade between the European Union and the United States has grown a lot. Altogether, the value of goods and services traded between them reached a record high of $1.1 trillion. Large economies like Germany and France made up a big part of that amount. The U.S. government's Trump tariffs unexpectedly disrupted this strong trading relationship. The first wave of steel and aluminum tariffs had already worried European manufacturers. But the new tariffs placed on cars and car parts on April 2nd were likely the biggest shock yet. For years, countries like Germany, France, and Italy had been exporting their vehicles and parts to the U.S. with no issues. Now, tariffs ranging from 25% to as much as 30% on certain goods are seriously affecting this trade system. According to information from EU sources, Brussels is now seriously planning to strike back. "We won't continue to let this one-sided escalation go unanswered. We'll use all the tools we have to defend our products," said the Commission's Vice President on the night of April 3rd. "The main question now is which products we will target," he added. Industry insiders say that the EU is considering retaliation against American goods in sectors like cars, medicine, clothing, electronics, steel, aluminum, and even alcohol. Because these products sell very well in Europe, von der Leyen said, In 2023, the U.S. sold more than $400 billion worth of goods to Europe. We're looking at ways to cut that number by nearly half. If that happens, new tariffs of 20 to 30% could make things very tough for American exporters. At this point, the positions of the EU's biggest economies, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, are going to be very important. Germany is the center of European manufacturing, especially when it comes to cars and machines. It exports about $110 billion worth of goods to the U.S. each year and is becoming more open to fighting back with tariffs on U.S.-made cars and parts. Germany says its exporters have suffered under the American steel and auto parts tariffs. If the U.S. is attacking our car industry, we have to react in the same way, said Germany's economy minister on April 3rd. Even a strong exporter like Germany is losing its patience. While Germany sold goods worth $110 billion to the U.S., France's exports were around $70 billion. Italy and Spain also had solid positions in the U.S. market, with $50 billion and $45 billion in exports respectively. But the Trump tariffs didn't just damage this big trade system, they also pushed the EU into creating retaliation plans. On April 3rd, the Commission's vice president said, "No one should think we won't respond. We must protect our own manufacturers. The only question is which products we'll target first." According to EU insiders, the list for possible retaliation includes cars, medicine, clothing, electronics, steel, aluminum, and alcohol. Europe is a major market for American products. It's estimated that U.S. companies sell over $500 billion worth of goods to Europe each year, especially materials like steel and aluminum. If Brussels puts 20 to 25% tariffs on these items, it could hurt American companies' ability to compete. France also has a similar situation. American cars already had only a small share of the French market, and U.S. brands were more involved in selling wine and luxury products. Now France has said publicly that it is thinking about putting tariffs on American wine and spirits like bourbon and whiskey. "We're working on a clear list together with other EU countries," officials said. Gabriel Peard, head of the FEVS trade group, told French TV channel BFM that the new U.S. tariffs will likely reduce French wine and spirit sales in the U.S. by at least 17%. FEVS said it was very disappointed by the U.S. decision, saying it hurts both French producers and their American partners, and most of all, American customers. They expect France's exports to drop by about 400 million euros, while total EU losses could reach 2 billion euros. The exporters group warned that such a drop could seriously affect jobs and the wine and spirits industry in general. According to the French government, President Emmanuel Macron will meet with business leaders affected by the U.S. tariffs at the Élysée Palace on Thursday. In the past, the EU raised taxes on American whiskey in response to U.S. tariffs, which caused political problems in some southern U.S. states. The same thing might happen again. Wine and liquor producers, especially in France and Italy, have powerful influence. So a similar move now could put pressure on U.S. politicians. In Italy, there's talk of adding new tariffs on American clothes and fashion items. In recent years, American sportswear and denim brands have become more popular in the Italian market. If Italy puts a 20% tax on these products, it could cost U.S. clothing companies billions of dollars. In 2023, Italy imported about $2.5 billion worth of clothes and textiles from the U.S., much of it from well-known brands, things like shirts, pants, and sneakers. On April 3rd, Italy's economy minister said, "We might take action on clothing and fashion goods." Meanwhile, Spain is thinking about putting tariffs on U.S. farm and food products. These include corn, soy, and meat, which are important in Spain's food and animal feed industries. In 2023, Spain imported about $3.8 billion worth of these goods from the U.S. Now, Spain's government is saying, if we have to, we'll use tariffs on agricultural goods too. Also, if the U.S. puts limits on Spain's wine and olive oil exports, the EU might respond by taxing more American farm products. Experts say that big farming countries like Spain and Italy won't hesitate to use tariffs to pressure the U.S. farm lobby. Countries like Spain and Italy, which have large farming sectors, would likely use tariffs to pressure the U.S. farm industry. In Northern Europe, countries like Sweden also trade closely with the US, especially in technology and machines. The EU is also thinking about placing tariffs on American tech brands. Documents leaked from the European Commission show that extra taxes of 20 to 25% could be added to US electronics and chip parts. This could put pressure on the US government since it would hurt American chip makers and big tech companies. Recently, the EU Commission said, "We won't accept one-sided rules on technology sharing. If needed, we'll add new taxes on sensitive products." Ireland's Prime Minister Michael Martin said that these tariffs would hurt the world economy and harm EU-US trade. "There's no good reason for this," he said. Over €1 billion worth of goods and services are traded between the EU and US every day. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson agreed. He said tariffs go against free trade and the kind of business values that made the West successful. "That's why Americans can listen to music on Swedish Spotify, and we can use American iPhones," he said. It's sad to see the US taking a path that limits trade. Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo called the tariffs worrying and added, "No one wins in a trade war. It hurts businesses, consumers, and the economy. The EU is ready to react and to talk. Finland is ready too." Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said the tariffs should be equal between the US and Europe. "We need to make the right decisions," he said. Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen also criticized the US, especially after American leaders spoke about wanting control over Greenland. He said, "Trade wars hurt everyone. Instead of building walls, we should remove them. Europe will stand united and respond clearly and fairly." Norway's Trade Minister Cecilia Myrseth said that the US plan to place a 25% tariff on Norway, though it's not in the EU, could badly hurt the Norwegian economy. In the US, about 80% of coffee beans come from Latin American countries like Brazil and Colombia, according to the US Department of Agriculture. These countries are now facing new US tariffs of 30% each. Chocolate is another big import from Latin America, mainly because the US doesn't have the right climate to grow cocoa. Countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Ecuador supply cocoa beans to the US and will now be taxed at 25% and 30% respectively. Also, a new 20% tariff will be added to products imported from Switzerland. This will affect a wide range of goods, from affordable watches like Swatch to luxury ones like Rolex. When we look at the numbers, Germany sends about $110 billion in goods to the US each year. France sends $70 billion, Italy $50 billion, Spain $45 billion, and Sweden $30 billion. Together, these 5 countries account for more than 80% of what the US buys from the EU. If Brussels leads a joint EU decision to strike back, these countries will play the biggest role. The US exports around $50 billion in steel and aluminum to Europe. It also sends $70 billion in cars and car parts and $40 billion in medicine and chemicals. If the EU decides to place tariffs on all these goods at once, over $160 billion in US exports could be at risk. These numbers show why the US needs to be cautious. But the Trump administration still isn't backing down on tariffs. One of the biggest concerns is how this trade fight will affect people's wallets. If the EU adds new tariffs to American goods, prices for US products in Europe will go up. This could make inflation worse, but it might also help European businesses by making local products more attractive. For example, European steel companies might sell more because American steel would become more expensive. The same could happen with European car brands replacing American ones. But if the US reacts by adding even more tariffs, it could start a cycle that gets worse and worse. The Trump administration has a long list of European goods that could be targeted. Food items like cheese, wine, pasta, and also cosmetics, chemicals, and car parts. Leaked reports from Politico and Reuters say these US tariffs might start at 10%. Then increase to 25%, 40%, or even 50%. Putting tariffs in place on a patriotic holiday like Independence Day might look good in the short term, but experts say this could isolate U.S. businesses from global markets. Historians warn that once trade wars begin, they're hard to stop, just like what happened during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Looking at the numbers, trade between the US and EU is close to $1.1 trillion. Cars and advanced technology make up about 1/3 of that. Other big areas include steel, aluminum, food, and clothes. If the EU really does add tariffs between 20% and 30%, U.S. companies could lose over $100 billion in business each year. This would hit their production and hurt jobs in America. Some people in Europe might also complain that U.S. goods are getting too expensive, but EU leaders say if we're going to lose, then the U.S. should lose too. That way, both sides will have a reason to negotiate a fair deal. Some people in Europe are worried because many companies import raw materials, parts, and certain farm products from the U.S. These new tariffs will make it harder for them to keep doing business as usual. Finding the right balance won't be easy. At the same time, the EU has a warning for the U.S. You can't just sell your products to other regions and expect everything to be okay. For example, if Europe stops buying American farm products, the U.S. might try selling them in Asia or the Middle East instead, which could lead to price dumping, selling goods really cheap just to compete. The EU says the U.S. is creating an artificial trade crisis that didn't need to happen. Media outlets like the BBC and Reuters have described this as the worst trade war since the Great Depression. Politico called it Europe's fight to survive. In short, the U.S. has started with a base tariff of 10%, then added extra tariffs between 20% and 30%, sometimes even reaching 40% to 50%. These taxes are hitting the most important parts of EU-US trade: cars, steel, aluminum, clothes, and electronics. If this fight keeps going, global markets could become even more unstable. Investors are already reacting. They're selling stocks because of the uncertainty. Stock markets like Germany's DAX and France's CAC have been shaking. Shipping companies are overwhelmed and warehouses are getting full. On Thursday, after Trump announced new tariffs, European stock markets opened lower. One big retail company, Adidas, saw its stock fall 11%. Shipping giant Maersk also lost value. The Eurozone stock index, which reflects world trade, dropped by 6%. The auto sector was hit the hardest, falling over 10% as the new car tariffs kicked in. Other sectors like banks lost 7%, while utilities, usually more stable during market trouble, gained 2%. The U.S. announced tariffs on over 100 countries and regions, including a 25% tax on EU goods and a 20% tax on UK goods. The UK's FTSE index dropped 4%, France's CAC fell 6%, and Germany's DAX lost 7%. Interestingly, healthcare stocks rose 3% after the U.S. confirmed that medicine wouldn't be taxed. The euro rose by 2% against the U.S. dollar during Thursday morning trading, its highest level since last October. Some experts are asking, is this Europe's version of what happened to Tesla in Canada? When Canada placed tough sanctions on Tesla, it sent a strong message to both Trump and major U.S. companies. We won't back down. Now Europe seems ready to do something similar. Tariffs may seem like they protect local industries in the short term, but over time, they can hurt everyone. Still, the EU believes that if damage is going to happen, they won't just sit back. They'll respond with their own tariffs to balance things out. Some say this could become the biggest trade crisis since the 1930s. Others believe that because both Trump and the EU are being tough, they'll be forced to meet at the table and agree on a new trade deal. We'll have to wait and see who's right. What we do know is that Europe is ready to place new tariffs of 20% to 30% on key U.S. products like cars, steel, aluminum, medicine, clothing, electronics, and liquor. Countries like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Sweden are finalizing their lists of which products to target. If those lists become law, American goods in Europe will get more expensive and U.S. exporters will lose money. The timing is still uncertain, but tensions are definitely rising. So, what's your take? Is the EU right to fight back, or is the world headed toward a bigger trade crisis? Will the U.S. government back down or raise tariffs even more, risking damage to the global economy? Join the conversation, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned. These trade wars could impact not just Europe or the U.S., but the entire world economy, including prices, jobs, and politics. We'll keep you posted as things heat up.